It's a privilege to be with you on the 51st anniversary of MCC. And I know something about the formation of MCC and Troy Perry, though I'm not MCC myself. And I thought a lot about that early history of your denomination and wondered what ingredients go into making a movement like this one. I marveled at how one person could be so courageous and so visionary and so unrelenting in the face of adversity, so tenacious in doing what he believed was right and just and good. How is it that Troy Perry and that early group of 12 people meeting in his living room could work so persistently to cultivate such a liberative church as this one? And in the late 60s, pre-Stonewall, how did he keep going in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges? The story of the beginning has a failed suicide attempt. What does it take to maintain a sense of hopefulness against ever-encroaching despair? What sustains our souls against the onslaught of hatred and violence that swirls in our collective consciousnesses and our news cycle and the halls of political power? These could be some backwards-looking questions about the ingredients and the origin of MCC, and that history is definitely worth celebrating. But I want to ask this question with an eye toward your future, not MCC at large necessarily, but you here at MCC Boston. Courage could be one of the ingredients, bravery, vision, resolve, faithfulness, strength. All of those qualities have their place in the recipe of such a visionary, tenacious person like Perry and such a movement like this one that you are a part of. But the one ingredient that I kept coming back to when I was thinking about the origin of this movement was something not often mentioned alongside the litany of other virtues that cultivate a justice-seeking person like Perry or anyone else. And that's the ingredient of imagination. It's not as celebrated as some of the more potent qualities like courage and bravery, but it's hard to imagine a more important quality in a person following a strange sense of call to life beyond the status quo. And I wondered, as we move once again into our own politically volatile election cycle, faced with a world that at times seems to be coming apart at the seams, what has a hold on our own imaginations? What narratives and images and metaphors occupy our own imagination space, clouding our vision for the possible and speaking so loudly in our ear that we have such a hard time seeing beyond the stifling realities of the status quo? I know that folks here at MCC Boston are doing your own work, discerning together how to live your faith in the world, how to do the work of justice in the public square, what it means to cultivate your imaginations, to see possibility amid the peril, and to envision a world beyond the dictates of the status quo. And as near as I can tell, that's what Jesus was up to when he told stories to anyone who would listen, cultivating their imagination. We usually call these little stories parables, and cultivating the imagination is what parables do. It's what they're for, to cultivate imaginations, to dream of a reality beyond the status quo. Dale Allison puts this poignantly, saying, Jesus is above all an author of parables and a devotee of the imagination. He cannot report, but only imagine. Jesus sets out in word and deed to fracture the hypnotic hold of life as it has always been. And if you read the Gospels, you begin to see Jesus' favorite topic to toy with in these parables is the kingdom of God, or as we often say, the kingdom of God, the way of God's relating all things together under the reign of God. He never reports on the kingdom of God in prosaic terms. He just tells stories that in some small way fracture the hypnotic hold that all of the common everyday images of kingdoms have over people's imaginations. They usually began something like today's parable. The kingdom is like. In Jesus' day, the kingdom was the empire of Rome. The kingdom is like legions of armed fighters marching through a region, indestructible, removing any obstacle that stands in the way of domination. In an era like ours, the kingdom is the United States, an empire of a different kind. Militaristic images of the kingdom have a hypnotic hold on our imaginations. Capitalistic images, market-driven metaphors guide life in order to defend walls and borders and wealth and everything that we feel so possessive over. And if you dare to posit that there is another way to construct a society, you risk being seen like Jesus, like Perry, like MCC, seditious, heretical, un-American. But Jesus was a devotee of the imagination. He's never willing to let the ordinary life as it has always been story have the final sway over our conscience. So it helps to begin to imagine life in metaphors that are large enough to fracture the hypnotic hold. It's the reason Jesus tells an odd little story like this. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. Or in Amy Jo Levine's translation, which is a bit closer to the Greek original, similar to the kingdom of heaven is leaven that a woman taking hid in 3 measures of flour until it was leavened all. The lectionary pairs this parable with a couple of other parables that you know, the parable of the mustard seed, the parable of the treasure, the parable of the pearl. And maybe you've never read this parable, this one-sentence parable in isolation before. But if you have to subsume this message within the messages of other similar but rather different parables, some interesting nuances and details get lost. So let's look at how Jesus told this particular one-sentence story. Here are some interesting details. For example, a woman. Read through all the parables of Jesus and note how many times he compares the kingdom of God to something taking place in the activity of a woman. It's not that no one was telling stories of women in first century Israel. Much of the Hebrew Bible contains stories of women who were often far more faithful and virtuous than the men in the stories, but he didn't have to tell the parables in ways that featured women. After all, he was speaking in the very masculine patriarchal language of kingdom. Now, presumably, like any storyteller, Jesus told his stories over and over again in various contexts to different audiences, and undoubtedly he told them this little story a different way each time. In Matthew's rendition of the story, the kingdom of heaven is like the leaven that a woman took. But in the Gospel of Thomas, one of those books that didn't make it into our New Testament, the writer remembered the parable a little differently, perhaps from a different time that Jesus told it. In Thomas, it isn't the leaven that resembles the kingdom, but the kingdom is like the woman who took the leaven. Gospel of Thomas says, what the kingdom of the Father resembles is a woman who took a small amount of leaven, hid it in some dough, and produced huge loaves of bread. The kingdom resembles a woman. And then there are some things that we would otherwise miss if it were not for the study of the original Greek text and are able to challenge the less than stellar translation of the gospel that we often read from. For example, the translators of the New Revised Standard Version translated the text to say that the kingdom is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour. But Amy Jill Levine, New Testament scholar at Vanderbilt, says we need to correct the translations that have the woman mixing the yeast into the dough, because that's not what the Greek says. Levine says that what the woman is doing here in the Greek is hiding the leaven. The kingdom is like leaven that a woman taking hid in the flour. She continues, this woman is doing something cryptically rather than in an upfront manner that can be controlled. The kingdom is like something being done in secret, like something cryptic, hiding something where it may not belong, with the motivation for such surreptitious activity left totally in question. Was the bread supposed to be leavened, or was it meant to be flatbread all along? And then there's some details we wouldn't necessarily notice unless we knew something about ancient measurements, like 3 measures of flour. In my mind, every time I have heard this parable, I imagine a woman using the kind of measuring cups that my grandmother would use when baking, mixing the yeast into 3 cups of flour, coming out with a nice loaf of bread. But that's not quite the case in this parable. 3 measures of flour actually amounts to somewhere between 40 and 60 pounds of flour. The image, Levine notes, is one of extravagance, hyperbole, far, far too much bread for one person to eat. And this woman might even be in the position to determine how to distribute this enormous amount of bread. The kingdom of God resembles a batch of staple food like bread that is so hyperbolically huge, so egregiously enormous that one person couldn't possibly consume it all. It's an image of extravagance, enough to feed a whole village. And then there are some things we could easily miss about this story if we happen not to know much about the art of baking bread. For example, when we read this parable, we shouldn't imagine little packets of yeast that you might use for baking. We should instead picture something more akin to sourdough starter. If you, like me, have never baked a loaf of bread before, you may need to know a little more about this. So I did some research about the baking of bread. Levine says sourdough starter is created when water mixes with the naturally occurring yeast spores that end up in the flour when it is ground, and then the yeast's enzymes break down the starch in the flour and convert it into glucose. The starter serves as the leavening agent when it is subsequently mixed in with more dough. Early bakers in ancient times would keep locally interesting yeast cultures by reusing dough and starters to leaven later batches. These leavened cultures would be transferred from batch to batch by means of previously mixed old dough. The kingdom of God is like a batch of microbes, things too small to even see, that you don't even realize are there. Microbes that operate through a process of decay to bring life to a lump of dead dough, invisibly transforming it into something both tasty and nourishing. Some of the leaven is so interesting and delightful that the baker saves some of the dough from each batch and uses it over and over to make loaf after loaf of delicious bread. This is what the kingdom of God is like. Food historians don't really know when yeast or leaven came into the mix. For much of ancient human history, all that was known in the world were flatbreads. You made the dough, you add some salt and water and put it in the oven and bake it, and you've got a tasty tortilla or a pita or something of that sort. The best that we can do is to speculate that at some point in ancient history, a woman set out to the communal oven to help bake her village's batch of bread for the week and accidentally left her mixture of flour and water sitting out on a warm day a little longer than she should have. And unbeknownst to her, the natural bacteria in the flour starts to ferment. She may notice that the mixture looks a little strange when she uncovers it to roll out the dough. Perhaps she notices that it's a little smelly. It looks a little funny. Not quite like the other 300 times she had baked her village's bread, but what could she do? They needed to eat, so she puts her dough in the oven with all of the other women's dough and waits for it to bake in this big communal oven. Can you even imagine what it was like when they pulled that bread out of the communal oven that day? The bakers stand around with all of the women there baking the bread, and that one baker looks around at the women beside her as the loaves come out. They pull their huge batch of bread from the fiery mouth, and to all of their great surprise, one loaf isn't flat and heavy like all the others, like it should be, like it always is. Today, there is one loaf of bread that is lighter, fluffier. All of the communal bakers gather around to look, wondering what went wrong with this batch. They wait just long enough for it to cool a bit, and then they begin breaking off pieces of this bread, admiring the porous texture and the ways you can squeeze it between your fingers and watch it spring back again, almost like it's alive. And then one brave baker decides to taste the mystery bread, and the flavor is unlike anything she's ever had in her life. Then they all begin to taste it. It's the best bread they've ever had, and no one can figure out why this loaf of bread is any different from all of the others. They only have one recipe for bread, after all. They always make it the same exact way for as long as anyone living or dead could possibly remember. Only the one baker knows the secret of this fluffy and delicious bread, and she stumbled onto it completely by accident and hid her batch of strange, smelly dough in the communal oven among all of the others that would feed the village that week. And she smiles wryly to herself, not saying a word. And they all stand around the communal oven in awe of this special bread. The smell filling their nostrils, the sound of the crust's crunch making their mouths water each time another piece is broken off. It completely alters their imagination for what bread can be. Just one more piece, each says as they stand around the hot oven picking every last morsel off of this odd and delicious loaf of bread, their laughter and moans of amazed satisfaction filling the warm air as they savor every last mouth-watering crumb. And that is what the kingdom of God is like. And that should be what MCC Boston is like.